both within the Tibetan community in exile, amongst the diaspora, and especially within the People's Republic of China. But we also heard how necessary it is, because this practice of rebirth is embraced by hundreds of millions of people around the world. It's a relevant question from a theological standpoint, but it also has political implications and geopolitical implications, as we'll hear about today. This is a practice, as we heard yesterday, that developed and has evolved over time. Professor Gatso highlighted for us how this practice, grounded in Tibetan Buddhism, then spread throughout the region. And we'll learn more today about how that then has affected governance, not only within Tibet, but also practices and institutions in Asia and beyond. I want to say also, an event like this does not happen without the hard work of many, many people that are involved. So I want to first start by acknowledging the organizing committee whose vision it was to bring all of this together. So Professor Gatso, as well as Tenzin, as well as Lapsang Sangye. I think the three of you really inspired and brought together something that I think will be relevant not only for thinking about the theological as well as the academic questions that we'll be probing today, but hopefully will be of relevance as these questions move to the forefront of some of the contemporary debates in the years to come. So congratulations to all of you for assembling really this wonderful group that we've brought together. And I also want to take a minute and just acknowledge the hard work of the leadership as well as the staff of the Asia Center. This conference began under Asia Center Director and now Yenqing Institute Director James Robeson's leadership, and was continued very much and championed by Michael Pewitt, who you all heard from yesterday. And I think it really exemplifies the spirit of the Asia Center to take themes that have transnational implications from around Asia, bring those together, bring experts from around the region together, and really today experts from around the world, not just from around Asia, but we have folks joining us from Europe as well as folks from throughout this country, and really think about what those implications are. So I just want to ask all of you if you could join me in a round of applause to thank everyone who brought this together. And let me just offer a little bit of a preview for today's event before I open it up to our first panel. We will begin today by taking a look at the practice of reincarnation in Tibetan Buddhism and beyond. And then we will move towards a second panel, which will look at how this practice played out in a period in Tibetan history, Ganden Podong, and thinking about regents and succession and governance in that period, as well as relations throughout Central and East Asia during that period as well. Then we'll take a lunch break, and in the afternoon, we'll move to the contemporary issues about thinking about the present institution of the Dalai Lama, how reincarnation may play out in that context and the geopolitical implications. And finally, we'll close with thinking about the implications of what we've discussed today in the Buddhist world, in Asia, and certainly beyond. I think we already heard yesterday from Professor Gatso as to the rich array of universities and institutions that are represented at today's conference. What I want to do is take a moment also to highlight the rich array of disciplines that we have here today. This is truly an interdisciplinary conference that's connecting experts in anthropology, in history, in international relations, in law, in philosophy, in politics, as well as religion and theology, anthropology. We're bringing really folks who are the leading experts in thinking about these questions in their disciplines and bringing them into conversation with one another. So whether this is a topic for which you're a complete novice like myself, removed from something that you research day to day, or whether it's something that you think about, you've written about, you've engaged with extensively, I hope you will find today that you will learn from others who engage with a methodological and disciplinary approach that's different than your own. And I hope you will approach today with both an open mind and with a humility to think about these issues about reincarnation, rebirth, as they play out in Tibetan Buddhism, and certainly as they have implications beyond for our contemporary lives. So with that, let me welcome you all to day 2 of this conference, and thank you again for being here with us. So let me
It's a great honor for me to chair this first session of this workshop on reincarnation in Tibetan Buddhism and beyond. I actually will dispense, because Mark Wu has framed both practically and also intellectually the context of today so well, I think I'll actually dispense with any opening remarks. We have an extremely full panel leading off with 5 presenters, and so as I've explained to them, I will also dispense with lengthy introductions. You have their biography, their abstracts and their bios with you, and so I think in the interest, and I mean no disrespect by that, but in the interests of allowing them maximal time, I'll simply introduce them by name and institution in order to leave as much time as we have for discussion. I'm afraid I do feel compelled to ask our presenters to really do your best to stay within the time, because there's such a interesting and large and diverse crowd here that I hope we'll be able to have plenty of time for discussion. Without any further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, Weirong Shen from Tsinghua University.
Good morning, everybody. So I'm very glad to be here. As you all know, it's quite difficult to make the decision to come here, join this conference. But my basic instinct tells me I should come, since the topic of the conference is kind of mine. So about 30 years ago, I wrote my dissertation on the first Dalai Lama and the formation of the reincarnation system in the Garuba schools. And very recent years, I'm conducting a research on the Avalokiteshvara code in both in Chinese Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism. And also the third reason why should I come here, and because reincarnated lamas are extremely popular in China. I think maybe more than 15 years now. Maybe you heard a saying said along in the Chaoyang district in Beijing, there live 100,000 Rinpoches. So along in Haidian, not in Chaoyang district, somebody even says 300,000 Rinpoches. The Rinpoche are very popular. Then who are those Rinpoches, and where they come from? Are they real or not? So today I'm going to present the second part for the 3 reasons. The Avalokiteshvara code and its relation to the formation of the Tibetan, the reincarnation systems in Tibetan Buddhism. And to answer the question, who are those Rinpoches? And I think since the time is very limited, I just keep my talk short. And in the early days, I think we all think the theological or the philosophical foundation of this, the reincarnation system is the Trikaya system of the Buddha, the Trikaya theory of the Buddha. So Buddha has the Dharmakaya and the Sambhogakaya and the Nimanakaya. And the reincarnated lamas in Chinese called the living Buddha. That's why they are the Nimanakaya Buddha. So they come to the world. But I strongly doubted about this. And I think the Buddhas already went into Nirvana. They are not coming back. And the Nimanakaya Buddha appears only once in our samsaric world. That's the Buddha Shakyamuni. And the next Nimanakaya Buddha should be the Buddha Maitreya. We don't know when he will come. Actually, it's very how to say, the inspiring the saying by Qianlong Emperor in his famous Discourse of Lama. He said, 盖佛本无生，其有转世. Since the Buddha originally does not have a birth, how could he or they reincarnated? That's why I think the Chinese term living Buddha is wrong. All the living Buddhas are not Buddhas, but Bodhisattva. And I think the reincarnation system of Tibetan Buddhism is based on the Bodhisattva ideal. And they reached the Buddhahood, but they gave up the Buddhahood and came back into the samsara, in the samsaric world, for the sake of saving all living beings. That's why in Tibetan Buddhism, the most famous Rinpoche, the three Rinpoches, they are called second Buddha. They have no reincarnations, like the Guru Rinpoche, Pamasambhava, Jo Rinpoche, Atisha, and the Je Rinpoche, Tsongkhapa. They are all Buddhas, the second Buddha. They have no reincarnations. All the reincarnated lamas are actually the incarnation of Buddha, Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara. Or since I met a lot of Rinpoches in Beijing and Tibet, I often ask them, so who are you actually? Which Bodhisattva's reincarnation of you? And the answer mostly is they are the reincarnation of Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara. And some said they don't know. They're just the reincarnation of the previous lamas. And they don't know who they are. But most of them, they said, we are the incarnation of Bodhisattvas. That's why the Tuku does not mean the Nimanakaya of the Buddha. But the Chuku is the emanation or the incarnation of the Bodhisattvas. But most of them, they are the emanation of Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara. So I have said that there's two kinds, incarnations or emanations. I don't know, I use the right words for incarnation or emanation. Maybe should be the opposite way. There are incarnations like the Je Tsongkhapa, we turn to the emanation of Bodhisattva Manjushri. Or like a Papa Lama often also considered as emanation of the Bodhisattva Manjushri, but they have no reincarnations. But the other one should be reincarnated lamas, sort of is the individual's mind stream being the same as the Bodhisattva, such as the belief that the Dalai Lama's mind stream is the same with that of the Chanrensik and the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara. And then actually the notion of reborn appeared in Tibetan texts very earlier. We saw that those in burial texts in the Donghua manuscripts, and in the Gerab Sewe Melon, we have the story that the king Chisung Dezan and consulted the Guru Rinpoche Pamasambhava on the king's parents' rebirth. The notion of Yangtze is found in Tema text of the Nyingma school. So with the dissemination of Mahayana Buddhism, the strong beliefs in the emanations of reincarnations of Bodhisattva developed in Tibet. So I would say that, as I already mentioned, the Rinpoches I asked, and they told me they are the incarnations of Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara. But at least in the most well-known reincarnated lamas in Tibetan history is the Gamapa and the Dalai Lama. They're both very clearly being the reincarnation of Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara. And I will talk about later, the third, fourth, fifth, the Gamapa lamas, actually they developed a very unique the worship and the tantric ritual of Avalokiteshvara. So that's why they believe to be also the reincarnation of the Avalokiteshvaras. And Avalokiteshvara in code generally, I think, is very similar to the code in Chinese Buddhism. They are based the basic as scriptural foundation for the Avalokiteshvara worship is in those two sutra texts. One is Kalanidya Viyuha Sutra, in Chinese called Baowang Jing. Actually, that's the famous 6-syllable mantras Om Mani Padme Hum came from. The other one is just the Lotus Sutra. That is very earlier already disseminated in Tibet. But the base or the most important text for the dissemination of the Avalokiteshvara code, also for the formation of the Avalokiteshvara worship and the formation of the reincarnated lamas is based on actually on this two tema text, is the Kachin Kakruma and the Manikapung. So especially is the Manikapung. The Manikapung actually created the concept of so-called the union of the state and the religion, and created a national hero of the King Songtsen Gampo, and make him actually the Chakravartin king and the Dharma king at the same time. So he is in charge of the political and the religious issues in whole Tibet. So that was the origin of I would say the reincarnation system and the concept of the union of state and religion. And in both texts, the King Songtsen Gampo is described as the emanation of Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara. And in the king was the identity of a protectors of the snowland. And actually the first Kachin Kakruma is so invented biography of the King Songtsen Gampo. Then I think you will find it very clear in the first Dalai Lama's biography, and he just the author of the biography just follows what is described in the Manikapung, and to make the first Dalai Lama Genden Drupal as the reincarnation of the King Songtsen Gampo. And between the King Songtsen Gampo and the first Dalai Lama, there is the key figure, the Zongdenpa Gewe Junne, and he is a co-founder of the Gadamba school, and he was actually the disciple of Atisha, and he himself was even not a monk. But since Atisha, like the Zhou Rinpoche, Atisha is the second Buddha, he will not come back into the world, and he is also only in charge of the Dharma. Only but his disciple, the Zongden Gewe Junne, and even he wasn't a monk, but he has how to say the function of political and religious leader. And in this, the Gadamba schools, and then the Genden Drupal followed him as the first reincarnation of the Gelupa school, and also the so-called the second reincarnation of the King Songtsen Gampo. So became clearly the emanation of Avalokiteshvara. So the story goes when even the Genden Drupal was born in the same family as Zongdenpa. So that's actually the beginning of the reincarnation system of the Dalai Lama's incarnation in Tibetan history. Is exactly actually follows the model described in Manikapung. Then the second is actually the first. The tradition was it's already time, huh? 3 minutes, okay. The first in Tibet is recognized as the reincarnation is a Gamma-Gakuba lamas, and I was showed the third, the fourth, the fifth had a big role in Tibetan religious history, and especially in the dissemination of Tibetan Buddhism in China proper, in the late period of Yuan and the early period of the Ming dynasty. And we often think, so why actually the Gadambas was the first one who adapted these reincarnation systems? We often think because said the Gadambas were very strong religiously, but very weak politically. They never had a very strong, powerful those aristocrats behind them to support them. That's why they introduced this reincarnation system in their school. So they claim all the Kamapa Lamas are reincarnations of the Avalokiteshvara. It's also the same, exactly the same. They were in charge of the political and religious affairs, not only religious one. But indeed, I think I found out the adoption of the reincarnation system take the Kamapa Lamas as the incarnation of Avalokiteshvara, I think has something to do with the Avalokiteshvara practice developed by Kamapa Lamas. So actually I discovered 27 literal texts of the Avalokiteshvara code in Chinese that were translated during the Tangut Xia time and the Mongol Yuan and early Ming time. That means not even, this kind of practice is not even popular in Tibet, also in China proper. Because of those three Kamapa Lamas, they were very active in China. And one of the most, how to significant, the ritual practice is the Jina Sagala Avalokiteshvara. And I also recently published an article on that, actually the famous, the Ming Yongle event, they called the Nanjing Miracle, was called the, how to say, the great ritual and universal salvation were held in the Yongle, 5th year of Yongle Ring in Nanjing. Was supposed to be a Chinese, the earth and the water ritual, 水落法会, but it turned out actually was the ritual practices of the Jina Sagala. Is followed the text written by the third Gamapa, Rangchung Dorje. So that's had a very, very strong actually relations with Avalokiteshvara. Okay, then what I said, I want to raise some topics to discussion. I think recently, I think we should take all the three key concepts in Tibetan Buddhist history together and think the relations. One is the reincarnation of Tibetan lamas, the Chuku. Another one is the union of the state and the religion, the Luni and the Chuklani. The third one is the priest and the patron relations. I think the first two, reincarnation of Tibetan lamas and the union of the state and the religion, actually, they came based on the same idea. I said what was Avalokiteshvara code described in the Manigapum. But they are actually contradiction. And if the reincarnation of Tibetan lamas became, became numerous, they're all like each school and each area has their own rinpoches. They have numerous incarnations. Then make this impossible is a single political and a religious leader. The Chakravartin plus Dharma king within the whole Tibet area. So, and the second, I think the priest and the patron relations is very, very hard to discuss the topic. It was political or the religious. No matter is political or religious. That means all those the reincarnated lamas still seeking for a patron. That means outside the political and military supporters. And even the third Dalai Lama wanted to have this chewing relations with Altai Khan, and the fifth Dalai Lama wanted to have the chewing relation with the Gushi Khan and the Shenzhi emperor of the Qing dynasty. If we are still looking for that, then how can become so-called a political and a religious leader of Tibet? And the third one, I think, we should depoliticizing and restore the original religious significance of the reincarnation system. Anyway, even they say the reincarnated Lama is a political and a religious leader, but it's basically a religious affair. So if we return this issue into the religious field, maybe it is a little bit easier. And I say in the end, I wanted to emphasize the Ming Emperor Yongle and the Qing Emperor Qianlong's involvement in the identification of the Karmapa Lama or the Dalai Lamas. I think mostly are not very political. I would say I mean two stories. How the Yongle actually want to send the invoice to the Chupu monastery and to oversee whether they found the incarnation of the fifth Karmapa Lama. And also the Emperor Yongle in the famous Discourse of Lama, he made it very clear why he wanted to introduce the golden womb. The system is to maintain and to protect the authenticity and authoritative of the reincarnated lamas. We should not take it as a pure like exercise of a state power. It has some religious or the practical reasons. It's not pure political. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much, Weirong, for that very erudite presentation, blending theology and history. And I actually thank you for ending on an aspirational note. I suspect that the relationship between religious and political approaches to this question is going to be something that's going to come up multiple times over the course of the day. We'll move directly on to our second speaker, Tengyur Rinpoche, the founder of the Thubten Shedrubling Foundation.
Good morning to everyone. At the outset, I wanted to thank the organizers for having me here. I, as someone who was brought up in Serije, one of the Tibetan Buddhist institutions in South India for the last 30 years, and having spent many years at the feet of His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama, and listened to countless teachings from him, it is a privilege and honor for me to speak on reincarnation today here. So my short talk will be actually based on two official documents that are released by the Office of His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama and one unofficial document. But I wanted to make it very clear that I do not represent Office of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and all the statements is my own. The first document is His Holiness the Dalai Lama's Remarks on Retirement, which is issued on March 19, 2011. And the second one is called Reincarnation, which was also issued in 2011, where His Holiness gave teaching at the Tekchen Chuling Sulakang Temple in Dharamsala, and these documents were translated into English. And these two documents were still very relevant, and the private office still maintains that the contents of the documents were still valid, and they stick with whatever there are in these two documents. And recently there is an unofficial document about when many organizations, individuals, friends, well-wishers from all over the world ask His Holiness about the next reincarnation and the related questions, and the office issued this unofficial document. And so I will base my talk on these three documents. So not to go into the details of the history, the first presenter has very extensively touched many important parts. I wanted to begin with what is a tulku in Tibetan Buddhism or reincarnation. So as we have heard from the presenter, the Tibetan custom of applying the epithet tulku doesn't necessarily, in practical, stick to the enlightened being or the bodhisattvas. So over the time, it has become a kind of a custom to give the title to recognize a boy or a girl who has been recognized as a reincarnation of the previous. And this became practical and applied all the time. And in Tibetan community, reincarnated lamas or tulku are often called Rinpoche, the precious one, and they're also sometimes called as lama. And they're also called Gyase Tulku, which means the manifestation of bodhisattvas. So these are the terms that are used to refer to a tulku. And I won't go into the details. So the question again comes about, related to these three documents, about what are the ways to identify a mistaken reincarnation. As we might have, many of you might have seen the His Holiness movie Kundun and the 7 Years in Tibet, and also read many other documents. There are many ways that a new reincarnated can be recognized unmistakably. And His Holiness has very clearly stated in the document a few of them. The first one being instructions left by the predecessor, such as a predictive letter. And this is one of the most important, where the next reincarnation is going to come. There will be very clear instructions left by the previous Lama, in our case, the 14th Dalai Lama. And the second one is asking reliable spiritual masters for divination. And also in the document, it is very clearly written that the search team or the Ganden Potang Trust will consult the leaders of the all Tibetan Buddhist traditions, the high lamas, for their advice. And also, not only the human divination and consultation, it will be also seeking the predictions of mundane oracles, Nechung, and so forth. For example, in the case of 14th Dalai Lama, there were indications or visions that manifest in the sacred lakes of Lhame Latso, where the three-letter Akama came into being. So similar to that, there will be such predictions. And once the boy is chosen, there will be furthermore tests, such as letting him or her choose the unmistaken religious items, such as rosary beads or vajra and bell, or recognizing the previous lama's relatives, attendants, and so forth. So these are also important measures. And all of these things actually based on forming a search team by, in our case, the Office of His Holiness, the Dalai Lama himself. In the next one, I wanted to talk about what are the challenges that we see in the history of this tulku system. There are a few challenges on institution level and also on a personal level, tulku as an individual. The first thing we see in the history is that there is a lack of central authority that can recognize or govern the tulku system. In Tibet, the tulkus were multiplied, and the proliferation of the tulkus happened over the years. And by 1959, there is not an official number how many tulkus were there all around the Tibet. And also, there is a survey done by the Department of Culture and Religion, Central Tibetan Administration, about how many tulkus were there in India, Nepal, Bhutan, and Himalayan regions. Still, there is not an exact number. So the lack of the central authority is one major issue with the tulku system in Tibet, which led to sometimes abuse and the misuse of the system. For example, irresponsible managers of wealthy Lama estates who indulge in improper methods to recognize their reincarnations. So it became a kind of hindrance to recognize the real reincarnation, because the previous managers, they do not want to part with the wealth and the estates and end up recognizing something consciously belonging to their own relatives or family. And this really undermined the Dharma, the monastery community, and the Tibetan society. And also there are various political ends engaging in various deceitful means using Buddhist masters and tulgus to fulfill one's own political motives. And if we talk about tulgu as an individual, when a boy is recognized as a tulgu, a reincarnation belonging to one particular monastery or institution, the boy is taken away from the parents. And that boy usually ends up in a very difficult upbringing. So I'm just talking about a very small percentage. Of course, there is great positiveness to it. Being a tulgu in a Tibetan and Himalayan society has a great advantage to benefit the community, help the community. There's tons and millions of benefits. But one of the few disadvantages is that some of the individual doesn't like the upbringing, because your upbringing begins with a very adult community, very high lamas, and you are usually taken to a very far away monasteries, not letting you meet your parents and so forth. And once you're in your studies, you're always expected to excel in your studies and practice. You're always expected to do better than the rest, which really gives you a lot of pressure. And this often leads to burnout with the young tulgus that we see in many monasteries. So as per these two documents and the third document, as for His Holiness the Dalai Lama's institution, His Holiness has very clearly mentioned few points with respect to his reincarnation. For example, the instructions that we see from these documents, the first is that His Holiness has time and again and reiterated and that he will leave very clear guidelines about how to choose if there is a need for the next Dalai Lama. And the document itself reads, "While I remain physically and mentally fit, it seems important to me that we draw off clear guidelines to recognize the next Dalai Lama so that there is no room for doubt or deception." And His Holiness also reiterated in this document that no golden urn or any Chinese interventions were involved with the recognition of 14th Dalai Lama himself. When he was recognized as the reincarnation of 13th Dalai Lama, there were no foreign intervention. It was purely followed according to the Buddhist tradition. So the letter also reads, "When I was recognized as the 14th reincarnation of the Dalai Lama in 1939, the priest-patron relationship between Tibet and China had already come to an end. Therefore, there was no question of any need to confirm the reincarnation by employing the golden urn." And then, finally, the document also says that His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama has the legitimate authority over where and how he will take rebirth, and how that reincarnation is to be recognized. So he, as a living the 14th Dalai Lama, and having the full authority, he makes it very clear that he has the full authority and able to make decision where he is going to take next rebirth. The letter also reads that, "I make the following declaration. As I mentioned earlier, reincarnation is a phenomenon which should take place either through the voluntary choice of the concerned person or at least on the strength of his or her karma, merit, and prayers. Therefore, the person who reincarnates has sole legitimate authority over where and how he or she takes rebirth and how that reincarnation is to be recognized." And then time and again, apart from these two documents, the Central Tibetan administration also recently passed a resolution which confirms that the responsibility for looking for the next reincarnation of His Holiness completely rests on Kandan Podang Trust, His Holiness the private office, where His Holiness has time and again said that in those two letters that when I am about 90, I will consult the high lamas of Tibetan Buddhist tradition, the Tibetan public and other concerned people who follow Tibetan Buddhism and re-evaluate whether the institution of Dalai Lama should continue or not. On that basis, we will take a decision. So even though this document was issued in 2011, recently when His Holiness returned from New York with a successful knee replacement surgery, and the people offer long love prayers to him at New York and also in Zurich, at that time His Holiness clearly pledged to live very long, until 113 years, and this third document clearly states this. And that when the private office was asked again about the urgent need to look for reincarnation, so there are no foreign interventions and so forth, and his official statement was that there is still no rush to it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Senor Rinpoche, for what struck me as most interesting, a formal institutional history and analysis of an institution that is not usually treated in such terms, and then some consideration of the implications of that institutional analysis going forward. And I think everyone in the room shares your closing hope. Our next speaker, President Tawni Tidwell from the University of Wisconsin-Madison.
Great, thank you so much, Mark. I'm going to keep my own timer so I help out myself and all of us as well. So first of all, thank you to all the organizers for having me here and having all of us here, and to the Harvard Asia Center. Tukdam is a very vast subject, so we could go many different directions, and I'm really excited about the different kinds of conversations that we can have from this. I took over the lead for the Tukdam study 5 years ago, but as you can see from this slide, it's a massive team, over 65 team members, our Russian collaborators, University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I am, Mensikang, Delic Hospital, His Holiness's personal physicians, Amchi Tamdin, Amchi Seden Dorjitsang, and then also all of our monastic partners. And so this has been a project envisioned by His Holiness. And then we have, over the years, looked at how to apply that vision. And so this is going to be a talk that I was going to get into the science, but from Janet's kind invitation yesterday, I decided to ground us into the subtle body physiology, and then we can really take on some of the science if we want to in the question and answer session as well. So I'm going to be speaking on the ontological realities and the biocultural nexus of life in suspension with death, perceptual cues, and biomarker diagnostics for the Tukdam state. And so I use the term life in suspension with death to signal this confluence of two distinct intellectual traditions, the Tibetan Buddhist and medical tradition on one side, and then what I'm calling the Euro-American, from that intellectual history, biomedical and scientific tradition on the other side. So we call this modern science. And this is not necessarily located in individuals. So from our team, you'll see people that are hybrid trained, right? So Geshe Ngawan Norbu, for example, Geshe Loda Sangbo, who are associate directors, have their Geshe Larampa degrees, but also have done years of science training at Emory University, lead the science centers in their monasteries. I was trained in neuroscience as well as biocultural anthropology, but I'm also an Amji. So I was trained at Mensikang as a full-fledged Kachupa. So this is also how we're thinking through ways of knowing, different epistemologies, different ways of seeing the body. So how do these two traditions, these two ways of thinking about the body, also approach the time of death with these different systems of evaluating valid evidence, right? Different signs, different markers, perceptual cues, biomarkers. And from the Western tradition, right, the biomarker is really a point, a data point, or a collection of data points to look at underlying processes. What is consciousness, right? What is the mind? And actually, it turns out we don't have very good definitions of that on the Western side. On the Tibetan Buddhist side and the medical side, we have very rich, elaborate descriptions, right? And those are those tend to be really richly described phenomenologically, right, or from the perceptual experience of the individual, but not as much from the external cues. And so this is something from the Amchi side, or the Tibetan physician side, we look at very much from how do you gain knowledge about another person's body, right? And so I'm proposing that these two distinct intellectual traditions literally engage two different ontological realities or ways of being for which they evaluate this particular state. And so in this presentation also, I just want to acknowledge that many of you in the room have probably seen Donna Coleman's Between Worlds, the Tukdom documentary. And so what I'll be presenting here is also after that was concluded. So he finished that documentary in 2017. And since that time, we've had a flourishing of the science that we're looking at in terms of the Tukdom state. So connected to our conference then, what is Tukdom and its relationship to reincarnation? First of all, spoiler alert, we're not studying reincarnation, but we are looking at the mechanics, right, of this process. And then if we do have time, or maybe in the discussion, how does the Tukdom study relate to the institution of the Dalai Lama? And I'm really seeing this as a much broader conversation. His Holiness has had conversations with scientists for decades, and in many ways, the genesis of the contemplative neuroscience discipline came out of those conversations. So our director, Center of Healthy Minds, effective neuroscientist, Richie Davidson, changed his entire career from looking at psychopathologies, right, to looking at the healthy mind, looking at how the brain changes, so neuroplasticity, right? That has changed the entire discipline. So how has the institution, the Dalai Lama, shaped the way that we do science? And then also the conversation that scientists are willing to explore, willing to entertain, the kinds of evidence they're willing to look at. Now, the previous roadmap was looking at the project history, some of our findings, some of the new measures we're looking at, the implications. We can go there if we'd like, but let's go ahead and just kind of look at the physiology first. So the Tukdom study came out of this early conversation between, this is Richie Davidson on the left side, with His Holiness, where His Holiness was talking about his personal tutor, Gananti Rinpoche, the 97th Gananti Rinpoche, Kepje Ling Rinpoche. And this is when Kepje Ling Rinpoche went into a 13-day Tukdom. Right? He was describing how Kepje Ling Rinpoche had this beautiful radiance, a dang, right, that looked alive, more alive than he was when he had been almost about passing moments before, right? The skin elasticity staying very vivid, right? The whole body staying very erect and having a habitus, right, that was very much living from the external perspective. No decomposition during this time, and we can go into the chronomorphology of what's expected from the biomedical perspective. No putrid odor for these 13 days. Right, so Tukdom as this postmortem state, and we'll talk about what Tukdom is in just a minute, is becoming fully aware of this subtle state of mind that occurs at death. And as the subtlest mind then disassociates from the coarse body, that should be C-O-A-R-S-E, not coarse. So we're looking at the rakba, right, the coarse, gross body, and recognizing that fundamental nature of mind. This particular meditative state, then, that recognition is what we are operationalizing as Tukdom. And we can talk about where that is located in the text. So practitioners that enter this state, we observe a suspension of the normal chronomorphology, right? So usually when someone dies, they go into a pallor mortis, the paling of the body. You see actually the rigor mortis set in, so the actually stiffening of the muscles in 12 to 48 hours. That releases after 48 hours. You see that the blood starts pooling in dependent surfaces. You see a putrefaction that happens in 48 hours, right? And so what we see in our Tukdom cases is we haven't observed rigor mortis. We haven't even observed liver mortis, so the pooling of the blood in the dependent surfaces. And we don't even see the decomposition or the putrid odor set in. So this is very out of the ordinary, especially from a forensic perspective. And then the mind is also understood to no longer register these gross sensory impressions, right? That it's just the mind in its expanded state, or engage in elaborate conceptual elaboration. Wow, the time is going very fast. So what is Tukdom? We can think about Tukdom in many different ways, right? We can think about it as the heart samaya, the tuk, right? Dam, the damsik, right? The damja, the commitment, one's tutelary deity, the yidam that they are practicing, any of these above. So we think about guru devotion being very important for Tukdom as well. We can think about also how it relates to different kinds of practices, different schools, Dzogchen, right? Recognizing the nature of mind also has a different physiology. Usually it's released 3 days, doesn't go on to these long ones, whereas in the Gelug tradition, the Guya Samaja, very long dissolution stage, our longest case is 38 days, right? This was at Gyutu of Geshe Genren Sirinla. And then this particular physiology, psychophysiology of this meditative state to accomplish these central goals. So we can think about this framework across all Mahayana Buddhist schools that seek full awakening, or Buddhahood, to become maximally effective at relieving the suffering of sentient beings. So this fundamental obstacle then to this awakening is marikpa, is ignorance. And that's eliminated by the wisdom that sees the ultimate reality. So then we have the Tantric approach, the Tibetan Buddhist approach, which is this vastly methodologically rich approach to obtaining this most effective wisdom by seeing the ultimate nature of mind in its most fundamental form. And here also we already see this kind of mapping between traditions, right? That the foundational paradigm is that the mind is the basis of reality, right? And in the Western perspective, what is mind? Right? We have not quite a definition of that yet. And then death provides this particular context to become fully aware of the subtlest state that occurs at death, right? This coarse body. And so this subtlest state of mind then is the clear light mind, the usal mind, right? And in the rehearsal for this moment, the practitioner then uses techniques to induce the bei usal, the simulated clear light, right? So you can have recognitions happening throughout the life of this practitioner, but the death context is critical. It's the Olympics of enlightenment, right? And so practitioners then have to have a high degree of control in manipulating their winds, the lung, right, generally and also particularly in the death process. And there's many different methods of this simulation across the tantric landscape. And so in our Gelug context, because that's where we are primarily looking at, we're looking at the Guya Samaja, especially the generation stage, and reminding us that this visualization is the mandala of a three-dimensional, multi-sensorial, multi-experiential visualization of a landscape, a universe, and that the subtle body then of the generation state is really clearing the knots, loosening the knots at these intersecting nodes of the three channels during that generation stage, and then the completion stage is literally bringing from the left and right winds into the central channel, except for one during the rehearsal, and also then collapsing that. We're going to see that in just a minute. So the Tibetan medical illustration of the channels is here. We can think about them as cognitive affective and physiological implications. I like to describe it as the neuroendocrine system. So you can think about the Tibetan medical tradition took the body and cut it up in different ways from the Western body. And our way of understanding it from the Tibetan medical side crosses over the body systems that maybe the Western medical system recognizes. And so the neuroendocrine system is a nice corollary or metaphor for that as well. So when we think of breath, and I bring this up because in Tukdam, the inner breath is considered to still be present. But cardiopulmonary function has ceased, brain function has ceased. So what is breath in the Tibetan system, right? So we can think about this in definite dimensions, the shape and form, a form of lung, or the wind, which has the capacity for movement by its own force. And then the term for lung is that it resides, particularly in this context, in the central channel, sustaining the life of the body of the living being. So this is the engine that allows this vivacity, allows this amazing vitality that you see in Tukdam practitioners to still exist. So lung, from the Tibetan medical perspective, is defined as lungitsani zuchin yangmatang tangje tala sashin yoyen. So it's rough and light, cold, subtle, hard, and mobile. And the main piece of this is its motility. So lung is about motility in the body. This is why it's related to signaling. That's why it's like any kind of cellular activity, movement is lung, is wind, right? We can also think about it as manifested in the external environment, but it also allows for the taking in of the vitality in the blood, also in the vital nutrients in the body. And so when we think about how the five elements then maps onto this, in the Tibetan medical and the Buddhist system, the five elements are not necessarily coarse elements, they're properties of matter and energy, right? And this then maps onto specific physiologies, right? Specific body systems, specific cognitive affective systems. And then when we take that and we look that into the Bardo system, so the 6 Bardos, we have the Bardo of living, dreaming, and meditation in the living state. And then what we're looking at in the Tukdam state is the dying state, the Bardo of dying, the moment of death, and moving into the Bardo of Dharmata. So from the Tibet medical side, we have many different signs that predict that moment. I'm not going to go into that. I was just given the 3-minute sign. But just to know that this is kind of predicting that process. Up until this point, we have not tracked a Tukdom case through the dying state. But this is to say that there's a rich, elaborate tradition of what kind of signs we would predict to see of someone going into the dying state, moving through the dying state. So distal signs, proximate signs, near proximate signs, and also how the dissolution relates to the phenomenology, right? That the practitioner themselves loses the sense of sight as the earth element dissolves into water, loses the sense of fluidity, so the orifices desiccate, the heat in the body. Now this is still present for Tukdom. There tends to be a heat at the center of the heart center. So His Holiness has talked about, he feels that Tukdom is the point right here where the fire element is still subtly active, and then moving into the space element. So I'm going to zip right through us and come to the subtle body. So moving through the different elements, then we look at the 3 subtle minds. And this is really what we're looking at in the dying state. And this is the Nangshi Topsum. And so in the physiology then of the Tukdom practitioner, right, we see that the right and left channels are actually entering into the central channel from the top of the head to the crown. This is the white bodhicitta drop coming down to the center, right? Different phenomenological appearances of, say, vivid moonlight. Then we see the red drops moving upward, also the left and right channels moving to the central channel, and moving and having a phenomenological experience of the rays of the setting sun, and then the heart. And I bring this up because this is the point that we are studying in Tukdom. So we are looking at, as the practitioner is bringing in the right and left channels into the central channel and moving that to the heart space, this indestructible drop is considered where the heat is retaining, right? And so this has shaped the way that we've actually looked at the Tukdom study in terms of mapping what would be recognizable in the Western medical system of this physiology, and then the phenomenological experiences. So I'm going to go ahead and zip through to just say that from the Western medical perspective, we have had a proxy definition of death as the cessation of cardiopulmonary function and brain activity, right? From the Buddhist side, we're really looking at the separation of consciousness from the body, right? And that occurs at the very subtle state. So how do we look at that? How do we measure that? And really, what are we trying to look at in Tukdom? And His Holiness has pushed the Tukdom team to say, I want this to push Western scientists' understanding of consciousness. We're not even close to there yet, right? So what we are doing is looking at what does this physiological state teach us in different disciplines of science, and that's what we've really worked on, is bringing in $200,000 kits staged all over India, looking at the EEG, the EKG, so the heart and brain function, temperature, oximetry, laying this out in the monasteries, having our monastic researchers trained in the electrophysiology, having our Tibetan medical physicians also trained in it. A Tukdom case arises, we go to the case, right? Holding trainings online and in person, bringing in a lot of these cases, publishing that, lo and behold, there's no brain activity at 26 hours after clinical death, not a surprise. But that we've really built a stronger team in bringing in now forensics. And so we just published, this is in 2020. So we just published our first article that looked at the longest cases. This is a 38-day case at Gyutut, and this is Geshe Genen Tsirinla, a 27-day case. This is Geshe Yeshi Tuptenla, to show to the forensic community that these are extraordinary, right? These are extraordinary cases that when we look at the biomedical view, it way exceeds the biomedical prediction for what the post-mortem physiology should look like. And lo and behold, the lay Tibetan population also shows a slightly different physiology, we think, right? And so this is Desi Sangye Gyatso talks about in the Bekar and the White Barrel that you should always leave the body for 3 days, 3.5 days, right? And that if you think about in the Tibetan context, right, because of reincarnation, that death is not as scary, right? When you're in a context where maybe you don't think anything ends, right? And so the biochemical physiology of not having extreme fear at death, right? Where you look at it as an awakened an opportunity perhaps, or that you are going to continue on into the next incarnation. Whereas for, say, a practitioner that sees this as the most revered opportunity for practice, changes how the body also responds to that as well. And so this is what we're looking also in Tukdom. So I'm just going to, there's our case. If they want to learn more, here is the QR code for our website. You can read more. The documentary's linked there. We have a Tibetan language version there as well, and all of our team members. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Professor Tidwell. The organizers and Mark Wu a moment ago promised an interdisciplinary day, and it's kind of mind-blowingly interdisciplinary. I realize that the arrangement of panelists is purely alphabetical, but we've moved through some really exciting different dimensions of this institution. She is Professor Sangzaraima Uchid from the University of Michigan.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and thank you to all the organizers for this amazing and very important conference. My talk today will focus on the trans-regional and trans-cultural aspects of the beginning of the Dalai Lama lineage and institution. And as a Mongolian and Tibetan Buddhist, I hope that what I'm about to say about these events that took place about 4.5 centuries ago will not offend anyone listening today. So I'll start off with some anecdotes from popular Mongolian culture. When we think about the Dalai Lama among the Mongols, we often think about the elite monk scholars, the Mongolian nobility, the highest of kind of society. But throughout history, the reverence of the Dalai Lama, or for the Dalai Lamas, was not restricted to the writings of the scholar monks or princes and Tej and Hans, but permeate all levels of Mongol society. So these examples, epic poetry, folk song, proverbs, and children's games, these are really not elite literature. This is the vernacular. It's the bread and butter of the common folk. So, for example, songs were really prohibited to be sung or practiced by the nobility. When I was growing up, my grandma would tell me, don't hum, don't sing, or bring bad fortune. So in this song, I'm going to sing you just a couple of lines. Dalai gedekchin osane han hana hui Dalai lam gedekchin shashne hana hui Dalai lam dan. And that's the emphasis I'm trying to bring to. Dalai Lam Dan. This is translated in the third line of the song. Our Dalai Lama. Dagan is a possessive locative suffix in the language of the Mongols. So this idea that Mongols saw the Dalai Lama as very much part of their own heritage. Another term, Mane Dalai Lam. Mane is the possessive plural for ours. So throughout history, we have many examples in different types of literature. The Mongols didn't really see the Dalai Lama as someone foreign or someone possessing a sense of the other. The Dalai Lama was and remains as much part of the cultural imagination and heritage of the Mongols as he was and is of the Tibetans. And I'm sure this is true for other populations in the Himalayas and parts of Inner Asia. So oftentimes, when we think about the beginning of the Dalai Lama lineage, this story is never untold. The meeting of Sonam Gyatso, the third, i.e. really the first Dalai Lama, and Altan Khan of the Tumut Mongols. But oftentimes you get just a passage or a paragraph at best in books, articles on the Dalai Lamas. So I'm going to tell a story that goes back a decade before their meeting to kind of uncover the translocal origins of the Dalai Lama institution and the lineage. So Professor Van der Kuyp here at Harvard, in his article on the Dalai Lamas, said something along the lines of, the Dalai Lama institution is connected closely to the invention of tradition, and coined the Dalai Lamas as Altan Khan's legacy, and this is kind of a perspective that sets the scene for this talk. So the story so far that we're often told tells us that there was a dark age of Buddhism in Mongolia where there was no Buddhism. Mongols abandoned Buddhism. After multiple invitations, unsuccessfully at first, Sonam Gyatso finally agrees to meet Altan Khan. In fact, he denies his invitation to come to Mongolia, and this is also a problematic story given that ultimately they met in Hokhnor, or Tsongon, in today's Eastern Tibetan province, and this region had been ruled by various Mongol groups really from the mid-15th century. So for all intents and purposes, we can't really argue Hokhnor was Tibetan or Mongol when it's being ruled by Mongol princes successively right up until the death of Lazang Khan's descendants in the 18th century. In any case, the story continues that based on their meeting, there was a second conversion of Altan Khan and his uncivilized barbaric Mongols, thereby lifting the darkness. And during this meeting, Sonam Gyatso declares Altan Khan as the reincarnation of Kublai Khan of the Yuan dynasty and himself as the reincarnation of Pakpa Lama. We'll talk about the story later on. And also, Sonam Gyatso is given the title Dalai Lama by Altan Khan, which began the Dalai Lama phenomena. So we'll challenge certain aspects of the story as we go back in history for about a decade. But to do that, we need to set the scene. So this is what Mongolia or Inner Asia looked like during the time of Altan Khan. So this would have been mid-16th century. The 1570s, early 1570s, we could argue, is when Altan Khan really started to take an interest in establishing a kind of Buddhism that could support his state. So what we imagine to be Mongolia at the time was divided into various factions that were ruled by different Khans. So the main Khan was Tumenjasak Khan, and this is Hagan and different to Han because this is the descendant of the Yuan line, and there can only be one Hagan, and that is decided by ancestral lineage and a right to actually be Han depending on who you are, who your father is, and where you were born into that family. So Tumenjasak Khan ruled over the eastern Tumen, highlighted in blue, whereas Altan Khan ruled over the western Tumen, highlighted in green. So Altan Khan, although belonging to the bloodline of Chinggis Khan, he was not in line to become Han anytime soon. There were many in front of him in the line of succession if Tumenjasak Khan was to die. However, Altan Khan was at this point in history one of the most powerful men, not only in Mongolia but also in China, having conquered the lands also all the way to the borders of Tibet, taken Hoknor, which had been taken by the Uyghur, who'd kind of assassinated father, but that's a different story, and had received the title of Shunyi Wang from the Ming Emperor, which came with certain trade permits, which no one else had access to at this point. He had fought 45 battles, had been engaging in a military career for almost half a century, and by all means he was the most powerful man, but he couldn't be Hagan. And in a way, this is the beginning of the Dalai Lama's story. The other part of the Dark Age story we're told is Buddhism disappeared from among the Mongols, but sites such as cave monasteries from all over southern and northern Mongolia show evidence of Sakya Buddhism still being practiced, the Sakya school being venerated by various Mongol groups. There were hermit monks from Kagyu, Nyingma, Sakya, from Tibet and Mongolia in the cave sites just surrounding Altan Khan city, which is today's Hukhat, the center of the province of Inner Mongolia Autonomous Region. Altan Khan also had even Chinese monks from the White Lotus sect in his court. He had a Taklung Lama, he had a Kagyu Lama, he had individuals who were trilingual in Sanskrit, Tibetan, and Mongolian. So he had no lack of authentic sources of Tibetan Buddhism, at his disposal. So why did he choose to invite to meet with Sonam Gyatso and ultimately propagated the Gaelic school across his territories? And this is something that was also taken up by the rest of the Mongols, is a good question. I'll get to that in just a moment. So the story begins about a decade before the meeting of Sonam Gyatso and Altan Khan. And we have the following quote from the the biography or the chronicle of Altan Khan. He who was born by the destiny of highest Tingir, the holy master of the world, Altan Sichin Khan. I'll let you read the rest for the sake of time. And I just want you to pay attention to the highlighted blue terms. So Sichin Khan was the ruling Mongol language title for Kublai Khan. This was a title Altan Khan had demanded from Tumenjasak Hagan of the Yuan earlier on in his life. And what he's wishing for, that's keeping him unable to forget by day and sleepless at night, his impartial mind wished for it. He's wishing for the religion and state, or Chersi, Lugni, or Turshashin Haryasan in Mongolian, that was established by Kublai Khan with Pakpa Lama as his preceptor. And this is clearly identified in this passage. So this is something he'd been thinking about for a long time, way before the meeting took place. So we have that happening on the Mongol side. And then on the Tibetan side, we know of the civil wars that's rife and the threat the Gaelic tradition faced from their rivals as well as other minor kings and so forth and the supporters of the Kagyu tradition that's going on in the 16th century. So there was, and this was mentioned by some of the earlier speakers too, the Gaelic school was seeking patrons outside of Tibet. The old patrons on the Rinpoche side and the Pagmuju were also in decline of power. So when Sonam Gyatso was recognized as the reincarnation of Gindun Gyatso, many members of his family were also propelled into important positions. This remains true today for many important reincarnate lamas and their family members. And one such figure is Ashing Lama, and he's said to be the maternal uncle of Sonam Gyatso, and we have a biography of him written in Mongolian, preserved in Inner Mongolia today, included in the history of Shirat Bana, one of the southern Mongolian banners. And it accounts how he was sent by Sonam Gyatso abroad to find patrons for the Gaelic school. And not only did he approach Altan Han, he also approached other members of his family, such as Hotuk Desachin from Ortis, one of the Gobi banners, as well as Norhach, the ruler of who would soon become the Manchus, as well as Likden Han, who would be the last great Han of the Mongols. So there was a attempt to find patronage for the Gaelic school going on from the Gaelic side. So when Asing Lama arrives in Hukhot and then meets with Altan Han in the early 1570s, it was almost a karmic meeting in a sense, if you think of it that way, of both sides requiring something, and the meeting would create a situation where it would benefit both. So the beginning of the Gaelic-Mongol relationship wasn't one of conversion from Tibet to Mongolia, but one of alliance, a very necessary alliance that could benefit both parties. In any case, Asing Lama meets Altan Han and accounts to him all of the wonders of Tibet, which includes one figure who's an enlightened bodhisattva, Sonam Gyatso, who sits in Lhasa, the seat of the great kings of the Tibetan Empire, who's Avalokiteshvara in person. So following this, about half a decade later actually, Altan Han sends a letter of invitation to Sonam Gyatso to meet, and there's no mention really of him coming to Mongolia. Sonam Gyatso immediately sends back a letter saying, we will meet on the lake shores of Hukhnor in XYZ time. I will leave from in front of the Jo Rinpoche statue in the Jokang, and we will meet in Hukhnor. So 6 months later, they meet on the shores of Hukhnor. Actually, it wasn't quite Hukhnor, the shores, but anyway, so it was in the Hukhnor region, and many titles and so forth were exchanged. But the interesting passage that I'm going to draw out from all that was exchanged between them is this. So this comes from the 5th Dalai Lama's biography of the 3rd Dalai Lama, which was written in 1651 as he is traveling to the Qing Emperor's court. So Altan Han suddenly faints, and when he recovered, he recounted his previous life. So this is Altan Han speaking. In the bygone time, when Pakpa Lama was erecting the temple of the realm, I was Hublai Sachin Han, and you, Sonam Gyatso, were Pakpa Lama. You performed the consecration of my temple, and we've been reincarnating from then until now. So it would appear from all the earlier sources that it was Altan Han orchestrating this reincarnate identity based on his quest to find his Pakpa Lama, someone that could propel him through the Institute of Reincarnation, or the theory of reincarnation, to the status of Hublai. So here's a man who's extremely powerful, who has his state in order, yet he doesn't have the title or the identity to be the leader of the Mongols. So given that the leader of the Yuan line is still alive, how's he going to do it? Through reincarnation, which also indicates a very in-depth and profound understanding of the Tibetan Buddhist world, the history of Buddhism among the Tibetan and the Mongols, and how these things such as reincarnation works. So from this moment, Sonam Gyatso accepts, so they become Hublai and Pakpa reincarnate in a form of an alliance, in the same way the Mongols and Tibetans understand the Yuan-Sakya relationship as well. However, hinging on this wish of Altan Han to obtain the legacy of Yuan and Hublai Han, who ruled it. So I had a few more slides. I think I have 3 minutes, so I'll try to be quick. So as for the titles and identity, just something to point out here. As Sonam Gyatso, we are often told, was bestowed the title Miraculous Vajradhara, Glorious and Excellent Ocean of Merit, which in Mongolian is Gehemshikt Vachardara Sen Chokt Point Tele. But if we take that translation word for word, it's the literal Mongolian translation of his Tibetan title. This was etched onto a seal and gifted to him. And there's no account of a title Dalai Lama being bestowed. This was just the translation of his name. So that's just something to bear in mind. It's really the alliance that's central to this meeting rather than a title being bestowed. Something else that took place during this meeting in support of this new relationship is the, bestowal of the Hevajra Tantra initiation, something that was carried out for all of the Hans of the Yuan dynasty, the Great Yuan dynasty, starting with Hublai, who received the initiation from Pakpa on the occasion of his enthronement as the Hagan of the Yuan. This was carried out for all subsequent great Hagans, and this is what Altan Han requested from Sonam Gyatso. Sonam Gyatso agrees, and not only does he bestow it upon Altan Han, but he also bestows it upon various members of his family. And this, in essence, was a reenactment of the enthronement of the Yuan Hagans. So Altan is now Hublai Han, and he's received all of the marks that would be given to a Han of the Yuan. This may have prevailed, but about 3 years later, Altan Han dies, and we can't say what would have happened. But what we can say is this model for creating new legitimization of identity was replicated by many other princes throughout the Mongol regions. So until Altan Han, there was really no Hans during this early modern period. We only have the Hagan, and then we have princes. But following Altan Han, we have tens of Hans pop up. How do they do it? They go to the Dalai Lama, whether it was the third, the fourth, later the fifth, for titles of Han, and along with the titles would come various reincarnate identities of individuals that were important to not only Tibetan Buddhism, but wider Buddhist history, such as kings from India, mythical kings. And they would go back to their lands and try to establish something of an independent region. Again, we know this didn't prevail, but however, it's this model that's being created that's important, because we see that, again, being kind of adopted and replicated between the relationship between the Qing Empress and the Dalai and Panchen Lamas, as well as the other Mongol groups that came to possibly conquer Tibet or invade parts of the Qing. It was constantly this relationship that's being reenacted, which in a sense started long before there was such a figure as the Dalai Lama, but because of this alliance, centered the Dalai Lama as the religious authority for these models of relationships. I know I'm running out of time, and I just want to say a couple of things about the subsequent Dalai Lamas. So the fourth Dalai Lama, we often say he was Mongolian, and this was important because he was Mongolian. But I would argue that the importance of the fourth Dalai Lama being a Mongolian isn't based on him, because he lived a very short life, but rather it set the precedent for Mongolian nobility being recognized as reincarnations, the tulkus of high Geluk lamas. So this happened all over again. The chart actually comes from Gray Tuttle's article, which I forgot to quote, I apologize, which seems to indicate from the early 17th century onwards, there was an explosion of Geluk reincarnate lamas, and many of these were sons of Mongolian nobility from all those regions I showed in the map earlier on. So this changed the kind of paradigm of power within the Gaelic school, but also in the relationship between the Gandam Pojong, the Gaelic school, and their various patrons in foreign regions. And we see this in the writings of the fifth Dalai Lama in his autobiography, where he says, 1617, since there was a large Mongol army in the country and the Tibetan leaders were forced to yield much of their land to them, it became customary to recognize the sons of Mongol leaders as reincarnations. Here he states it outright. It was said that I too was one, even though I was not a Mongol. So this idea of reincarnation and the impact it had on connecting regions through the shift of, well, the transference of identity in a sense, was taken pretty seriously by the Mongols based on what happened between the third Dalai Lama, fourth Dalai Lama, fifth Dalai Lama transition period. And although much, much, much more could be said about the subsequent Dalai Lamas, for the sake of time, I'll wrap up here with a last quote from His Holiness the current 14th Dalai Lama, where he says, Tibet and Mongolia have a very strong bond, especially concerning Buddhism. We're like twin brothers having the same spiritual tradition. And I won't say any more. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Ajit. I thought we had reached peak interdisciplinarity with Professor Tidwell, but it turns out we can go even further with, it would be anachronistic to say an international relations approach to the question, but maybe an interpolity approach to the institution of reincarnation. So thank you very much. Our final speaker is Professor Nicole Willock of Old Dominion University. Feel free not to extend the interdisciplinarity even further, but I'll give you that as a challenge.
You're going to hold on to your seats. We're going far here. Well, again, I extend a very heartfelt thanks to the organizers and the sponsors for this invitation and for creating this space for us to share our expertise in these fields, and also just to talk about this very complex issue of reincarnation in Tibetan Buddhism and the institution of the Dalai Lama. So my name's Nicole Willock, and you see I'm an associate professor, and I live in Norfolk, Virginia, and work at Old Dominion University. I've changed the title of my talk today a little bit. Here it is: Ethical Reflections on Methodologies and Technologies to Analyze the Tukul Institution from Text to Digital Humanities to AI. I said hold on to your seats, right? I'll spend about 15 minutes to cover a lot of ground. I'll present a glimpse of my own research that some of you have heard before, but I'm going to keep that part short. And I'm going to do that in order to reflect upon some of the challenges and opportunities that new methodologies and technologies present for the field of Tibetan studies. I will also introduce the latest developments that I could find on Chinese state-sponsored database on the Tukul Institution as requested by the organizers earlier this fall in Boulder, Colorado. I will end my talk very briefly by using AI to offer multiple ways of reading a passage of the text that began my studies into the topic of the Tukul Institution. The first time I presented on the Tukul Institution was at a conference devoted to the topic in 2013. It was hosted and convened by Tsering Wangchuk at the University of San Francisco and co-organized with Derek Mayer of the East Carolina State University. I had just finished my dissertation work on the esteemed 20th century scholar Alexei Shabchung-sung. A section of his autobiography, Acoustic Ambrosia, or Nawe Dutsi, analyzes the 900-year history of the Tukul Institution. I translated and analyzed this section of Acoustic Ambrosia, which gives a nuanced view of the Tukul Institution based on Tibetan historical texts. This section of Acoustic Ambrosia in particular fascinated me, especially in the context in which it was written in 1978, 2 years after the author, himself a recognized Tukul, was released from prison in Xining. I published my findings in a special issue of Revue d'études tibétaines in 2017, and in that same issue, I'm going to help Sungsarima out by talking about Gray Tuttle's important study on this. In that same issue, Gray Tuttle published his path-breaking study, Pattern Recognition, Tracking the Spread of the Incarnation Institution Through Time and Across Tibetan Territory. And so I raised some further questions here that might be fruitful for a discussion, but there's a lot to talk about, folks. So that's my presentation. Thank you very much for listening.
Indeed, that was not a false promise. I'm just going to move over here so that people on this side of the room get a chance to ask questions, because if I'm sitting there, I don't see you. Wow. I'm going to, people have said this before, but I want to thank our speakers, but I also want to, again, congratulate the organizers. This panel was framed as reincarnation, Tibetan Buddhism, and beyond. And we went so far beyond what I was expecting. Let me just briefly run through what I recorded as the 5 or 6, no, it's 8 or 9 different approaches to the institution that we've had in the last hour and a half. And I also should thank the participants for almost sticking to time, which leaves us lots of time for questions. So as I saw it, we've had presentations that touch on theology, on institutional history, on neurology, biochemistry, and biochemical physiology, popular culture and performance in the form of the song, but more importantly, international relations or interpolity relations, internal critiques of the institution, and then finally the impact of new technology, both digital humanities and AI, and the ethical and on the study of the institution, and then some closing ethical reflections on that. So congratulations to our speakers for going beyond. I've learned so much from this panel, so thank you all. We have about half an hour for questions. I'll just lead off as people, and then take questions from the audience, but I'll lead off with one question. So, Professor Shen, and this is really a question for anyone who wishes to speak on the subject. So Professor Shen ended with an injunction to approach the institution of reincarnation as a religious phenomenon. And I actually kind of was convinced by that injunction. And then all 4 of the next papers basically rejected Professor Shen's injunction and aspiration, and told us different reasons and different ways in which we should not look at the institution in purely religious terms. And so I would invite the panelists, I won't call on anyone, to kind of reflect on that juxtaposition. That is to say, can you say something about what is gained by not looking at the institution in purely religious terms, and perhaps some of the broader consequences? And just to set you up, Professor Shen, I might come back to you at the end for a response. Professor Willock, to begin.
Yeah, sorry. I'm a religious studies scholar, and I look a lot at the categories that we use, and so I just want to kind of focus on that for a second, because religion is also dharma, is dharma system, and then over time it gets translated as religion, but that's actually a 20th century phenomenon. Look is redefined, reused for political purposes in the 20th century by Tibetan scholars within China, trying to find a place for Tibetan Buddhism within China. And so I think we can't divorce it from the historical context. We have to look at what religion is at certain points in time, and how we're using that category, and how we're using the category of politics, which I know absolutely nothing about really, and its discourse, but I know quite a bit about the discourse of religion and how this term is constantly changing and the meaning of it's changing. But I really do like the anthropological move of Talal Asad and others who look at the relationship between religion and the secular as a dyad, as these 2 categories kind of mutually working together to define each other. And that's done by people at historical moments contextualized. So I think it's a complex issue that's not one in opposition, but that's kind of always working together to find themselves, and the parameters of that kind of shift over time. So that's how I look at it.
Thank you, Professor Ji.
I'm going to echo and add a little bit through that to say, although there are political implications and designs behind many of these things, it's really based on the doctrinal understanding of many things Professor Shen explained. Without that knowledge basis, then none of this could have worked. The people who this is being presented to and being orchestrated by have to know all these possibilities. That's why I kind of was able to set up these systems that lasted to this day and is ongoing.
It's not for me to interfere too much, but that is, of course, a tremendous justification for this conference. Professor Tidwell?
So I guess also maybe I didn't really clarify that we're also looking at the Tukdom physiology as breaking outside of reincarnation, that it's actually exiting the samsaric cycle. And so there's nothing that has been studied on how one single consciousness moves to a next being, and so that's not what we're looking at. There's others that are looking at that. But I will say that Lobsang Nyima Rinpoche, the 97th Ganchi Rinpoche, when his Yangtze was recognized, that my colleague Dr. Tenzin Namdala had asked him, and he was sitting on the bed where he had gone into Tukdom before, do you have any memories? Do you have any? And he said that I have kind of crazy dreams every time that I sit on that bed, and so I won't sit on that bed, right? And so how do we look at these stories, these narratives, and there's so many narratives and stories, but to think about that Tukdom is studying this physiological context, but doesn't necessarily say much about the reincarnation project per se.
I think that the reincarnation by itself, of course, is an institution, purely Buddhist practice, but all the time, due to different reasons, the politics and leadership came into play, so it's actually interconnected. I think one of the reasons still we can see in the Himalayan regions all over even today that when you're recognized as a tulku or reincarnation, you have higher authority, recognition in the society, and so there is some more potential. So therefore, we often see that purely Buddhist religious teachers often taking community leaderships, often that leading to politics in the later on. So I think that's a kind of a transition that we see, but they are not totally against each other.
Professor Shen, the challenges to you were more harmonious than confrontational, but do you want to respond?
So I didn't have time to, how to say, explain my approach to depoliticizing the reincarnation issues. But I think my consideration is come from two perspectives. One is historically, I would say that the reincarnation or the concept of a union of a state and the religion was invented by the Tibetan lamas in Manigabong, because that's because of the collapse of the Tibetan Empire, and we, the Tibetan history, so-called, went into the dark age, and we don't have like a strong leader politically and religiously, because the Tibetan society became very much religious in the 10th and 11th century. But they expect to have one like a big hero. He was like represented by King Chisung Dezan, and became the Chakravartin and the Dharma king at the same time. So it took the two functions of political and religious. But this kind of ideal never realized. And this also the basis of the so-called the union of a state and a religion. But never after the words, we never had a real a lama or a king who took those two functions well and became the political and the religious leader of whole Tibet. And the reincarnation system came from this ideal, but actually did something contrary to this ideal. Where there's so numerous reincarnated lamas, they share the same status as the other ones, is a reincarnation of the Avalokiteshvara. Then how it were possible to have a single political and religious leader of Tibet? He is the main figure. I'm the Avalokiteshvara. I'm the political leader and the religious leader too. So historically, but now in the reality now, I think the whole world, we are in the secular age, so is the state and the religion should be separated. No more like this kind of ideal, the theocracy of Tibet. Then I think if we still think those Tibetan, the incarnated lamas is both as a political and a religious leader, is actually in reality is not realistic to make then. And then other ways, I often say that the Avalokiteshvara or the Bodhisattva of the compassion, and he gave up the Buddhahood and stay in our samsaric world, is wanted to save us, save all the living beings. But now he is trapped very deeply in samsara. So I think if we want him still able to help us, to save us, maybe we should rescue him from the samsara first. So,
all right, thank you. Oh, you want to follow up quickly?
I just wanted to add one thing quickly. We have been asked on the Tukdam side to augment the study in all sorts of ways. And so one of the suggestions on the reincarnation side is, could you scan the brains of all the people, those practitioners that go into Tukdam, and then when they're reincarnated, their Yangtze is recognized, can you scan their brains and to see if there's a similarity? And it's just a fascinating question to me. What assumption goes into assuming that that would be the case? So there's a materialistic interpretation of that question.
Thank you. All right, so we have plenty of time, or some time for questions, but on the other hand, we have no time for questions at all. So could I ask you to raise your hand? I'll recognize you as I can. And given that there are probably many people who want to say something, if you could introduce yourself very briefly if you wish, but most importantly, make your question a question and make it short. And we'll start with this gentleman here.
My name is Atul Patray. I'm a student at Harvard Divinity School. This question is for Dr. Tidwell. That was such a fascinating talk, and I know nothing about the topic, but I was just very intrigued about, in the course of this research, when you're sort of examining these two different systems and modes of thought, modes of interpretation about the body, were there any correlates between these two systems that emerged in the course of your research that you found surprising? Correlates that maybe, you wouldn't have expected, and they sort of became kind of clear that, this maps more cleanly than I would have thought? Or things that perhaps, that you would have kind of, looking at the two systems in this kind of more naive way, you would have thought, oh, those are correlates, but in the limit cases of Tukdam research, you found that it's much more complicated than you would have thought.
Thank you, Atul. So I would say that one of the surprises for us is that historically, heat at the heart has been reported by, again and again, all the cases that we've been looking into. And when we have actually put our hand, you feel it, even if you look at different parts of the chest, right? So some people have said maybe it's a reflection of the person's heat. I'm not sure, especially when you change the positioning. The attending physicians to His Holiness Karmapa, when he passed, they were oncologists, rheumatologists, not Buddhists, said that they were very struck about feeling the heat at the heart. But we have not measured that, actually. We've had very sensitive infrared cameras. We got clearance from the National Security Agency to use their top equipment, and still it's black body, same thing as the surrounding room for those practitioners. We did also get permission to create a little pill that would measure the temperature that a practitioner could swallow, and maybe it would stop near the heart center. No one has agreed to that. Not surprising. But that's been a surprise for us on the what's expected by the tradition and experience. Something that has shaped the measures that we're looking at from the tradition side is the microbiome. And so in the Tibetan medical and the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, it's understood that simbu are throughout the body, these microorganisms, these perceptual organisms, right, that exist throughout all cavities, also around the body, that have beneficial, neutral, and harmful activities, right? So this is the microbiome from the Tibetan medical or the Buddhist perspective. And so in forensics, that has become the microbiotic clock of death. So now we have body farms all over the US and in Canada that people donate their bodies to science. And really what we've found is that forensics doesn't understand how to predict time since death very well, and that the microbiome has been a major measure that they've used to start really clocking that out. And so our next measure that we're going to implement is just to take a little bit of saliva in the buccal mucosa, nothing invasive, that we've received permission from all the abbots of the monastery to see if we can see some really interesting different changes. Are these microorganisms helping to maintain the vitality of the body, right? Are we seeing that this is maybe a multiplex of a being, right, that's in harmony with that? I don't know. And then the second is that when a practitioner goes into Tukdam, it's described that there's a very floral odor. So it's described as Tsujin-tima, so the tima, the odor of pure discipline, and that transitions to the putrid odor. So we have colleagues in the Czech Republic who are looking at this, that have perfumists, they have biochemists that have come on and created a library of these volatile organic compounds. And so we're working with some of them, and also a Belgian collaborator who trains cadaver dogs, cadaver rats, cadaver worms, to look at, can we actually look at that profile from the transition from the floral to the putrid, or the neutral to the putrid, which would be a really interesting contribution to understandings from that discipline as science. So that shaped that as well. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Jigme, and I'm from University of Calcutta. My question is for Professor Tidwell only. Is there any connection between Thukdam and the rainbow body, Jalutrupa? Thank you.
Jalutrupa, so rainbow body is when the individual, the practitioner, goes into the dying state in meditation, and that actually basically vaporizes, right? So, or emits light, right? And so in the Kalachakra tradition, it's a different kind of light body. And so actually the body shrinks, right? So there's been many remarkable cases that we get notified of all the time to follow up on and investigate. And so when you think about it from a scientific perspective, you would have to measure the body and its mass before they go into the dying state, and then measure it afterwards, right? And that's not where we're going with the work right now, but that's definitely an area that has been kind of along the side that we might look at some point, but yeah.
My name is Stefan Colligno. I'm at the economics department, actually. My question is to Professor Tidwell. The mainstream orthodox view is consciousness is created by the brain, just like the mouth is creating saliva. And there's a less orthodox or alternative view that says the brain is the filter and consciousness is outside of that. Do you have any views on that?
This is where our colleague Jima Bojigan has been really looking at that in the ICU to kind of map some of those understandings. We haven't had the opportunity to investigate that, and he kind of lost interest because his interest was really looking at, his theory really is a more distributed understanding of consciousness from the peripheral biology particularly, and also he's then been more interested in looking at living practitioners and as they cultivate these, say, pure presence or pure state, to look at that. So we haven't gone there yet. That's been the initial interest, and I think that's why His Holiness pushed a lot of the neuroscience to say, is it really an epiphenomena of the brain if actually the brain activity has completely stopped? We used auditory brainstem response, which is a measure that looks at activity in the brainstem. That's usually for people coming out of comas. No activity there. We've looked at mismatch negativity to look at auditory cortex signaling, which also tends to be for the subtle aspects of activity in the brain, still no activity. And yet what's maintaining this, the activity or the radiance of the body? So Professor Medvedev, Russian Academy of Scientists, our colleague, is really interested in the taking thermography, and some of the cases we have seen some activity in the liver. And so you could think about this as glucogen cycling, possibly. So I think that there's some interesting intersections, but because we can't get to a case during the dying process and it's already far into those post-neurophysiological processes, we can't have a comment on that. But we did also try electromyography, looking at the muscle activity as well, and the data is too noisy to investigate, but thank you.
There's so much to say and so many questions, and I hope there will be returning to many of the questions that were raised this morning. One observation is that all the questions directed at Professor Tidwell is a kind of meta-conversation about the religion and politics as a way of talking about it without getting into religion and politics. It's a way of talking about religious experience versus materialistic evidence. And in certain ways that maps onto that whole question of religion and the secular world in a certain way. I have a brief question for you nonetheless, and then I also want to bring back the question about religion and politics is the question that we need to be discussing and thinking about in all these various ways. But anyway, what is the purpose of doing Thukdam? And you know, is it just to sit in that state of subtle consciousness for a really long time and enjoy it? Like, why does someone do that? And also, what is the purpose, and this relates to the larger issue, what is the purpose of studying it scientifically? Are we trying to prove that it's true? Are we trying to, like, give evidence that in fact they're doing what, you know, like we can, you know, so is that the purpose of that? And I guess the third question would be, suppose we really somehow could prove that they're actually doing what they say that they're doing. you know, I think then we would have to agree that somebody who can transcend death, he has to be the political ruler also, because they would have so much power that, you know, how could, although that still remains a question. But, you know, I just, those are issues for me. But it then connects to the larger question that I also do want to raise about religion and politics. And my respected colleague, Professor Shen, you know, I would submit nonetheless that in the whole development of Mahayana Buddhism and the whole Bodhisattva idea, the idea of bringing together the secular and religious, I think Nicole is very right, it depends on how we define those terms, and it's very problematic and very difficult, but that's the whole project of Mahayana Buddhism, is to bring together religion and politics. The idea that you can't fully 100% separate them, or if you do separate them, it means that religion is not effective for the welfare of the people. And I just go back to the example in Sung Saraima's presentation of Altan Khan, you know, being obsessed with this idea that his previous incarnation was Kublai Khan, and the Sonam Gyatso was previously Pakpa Lama. And he's so obsessed, you know, I can really relate to this. He can't stay calm during the day and he can't sleep at night. And I feel that that's a really rich statement. And it's not, I think it's not only because he instrumentally wants to have power and political control. It's a really deep desire of a political and military ruler to connect to this deeper religious kind of experience. And maybe then he is going to use it as a tool also. But separating them, I think, is artificial and hard. I just want to end my own comments with, I wish we could have that. So the question is, how do we do that? You know, rescuing the Dalai Lama from samsara is a very interesting idea. It really makes me laugh, and I'm sure it would make him laugh as well, were he to hear that. But it would be wonderful if all of the parties who are involved in these kind of issues, you know, clearly there does need to be some separation, there does need to be some distinctions, and how that would work. I would love that we, like a follow-up to this conversation, that we all meet in Tushita Heaven or some kind of place and really sit down and work out how that would be. That's my hope and aspiration. Anyway, talk too much.
We'll talk about the funding of that arrangement later. Maybe we'll go to this gentleman here. Yeah, okay.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's actually really just to kind of respond to that point, so good timing. I mean, yeah, the Mahayana tradition very substantially tries to talk about this question when it talks about the nature of the bodhisattva, of course. You know, the bodhisattva doesn't require rescuing from samsara because the bodhisattva has actually deliberately, willingly remained in samsara. And here I'm thinking in particular, since you raised the question of the Manikambon, which is, and many of those texts are very strongly influenced by the Avatamsaka Sutra, and the Avatamsaka Sutra, along with Nagarjuna's works, you know, talk about, for example, the second ground of a bodhisattva. You know, the bodhisattva goes through the various grounds in which they perform the various perfections, and the second ground is described very explicitly as the perfection of moral discipline, which creates chakravartins. It's the perfection of moral disciplines that creates monarchs and rulers. Because of their perfection of moral discipline, they are in a place to create and enforce law. So there's a very strong Mahayana discussion of precisely that relationship. So just to follow up on that one as well.
Hi, I'm Yiga. I'm a current undergrad at the college, and I just wanted to ask a question in response to talking about the depoliticizing and restoring the original religious and significance of the reincarnation process. So obviously I feel like it would not be fruitful of a conversation if we did not discuss politics in relation to religion. And specifically I think with the institution of the Dalai Lamas and reincarnation, it's important to discuss the Chinese government's current attempts to, I'm going to word this very carefully, interfere and interfere with the reincarnation process. So I think that this conversation is largely largely political, no matter how much we try to depoliticize it. So I'm interested to hear how all of you panelists, like what your thoughts and are on this topic in relation to the Chinese government's interference within the reincarnation process.
Thank you. So that is one of the leading subjects of this afternoon's panel, I think. But well, we'll see. But let's hear from the panelists. We've got a number of topics, as you wish, and if you don't wish, that's okay. Maybe we'll start with Professor Willock and go along.
I agree with you. I think religion and politics is in the room. Again, I strongly think that definition matters. I think the time period matters. I think we need to pay attention to local context and who is defining these terms, because it's very, the Chinese state has a very particular definition of religion. In the United States, we often say, and we abide by this kind of golden rule that state and religion and politics are separate, but we know that they're not. You know, that on the ground, religious groups have tremendous influence in politics. And so I think it's teasing out those terms that is our quest, and it is a really difficult process.
Professor Eugene.
So this might be controversial, but if we're asking about the original way of doing reincarnation, what is that? And if we're thinking about, foreign influence on the identification of reincarnation, was there ever a time where it was just Tibetan from the very beginning? And I feel like I don't really have an answer, but those I think are important questions as we move forward.
Professor Tidwell?
So I'll keep it quick. Why do we go into Tukta? For realization, that is the natural unfolding of recognizing the clear light mind, and so the physiology is just the presence of that, or the physical manifestation of that. Why stay in Tukdam is another question, and so we have Dzogchen practitioners would say you don't need to. For the Guya Samaja, it's an incredibly elaborate mandala, and just the process of dissolving that takes a long time. And so to basically request them to release that state, the Samladhuva Tsakyut, the root tantra of the Guya Samaja, is recited to help them come out of it. So His Holiness did that for our longest case, our 38-day case. This is Geshe-gen and Tsinima, and he could have gone longer. And they say that you can bliss out. It's such an amazing, wonderful state. And if you do stay too long, maybe your reincarnation might have a slightly not as sharp faculty. And then why do we study Tukdam? Because His Holiness asked us to. And gave us access and encouraged monasteries to help manifest it. But on the other side, it does really ask this question about consciousness. This is why neuroscientists have been interested in it. It's an amazing context to look at this hard question: is consciousness an epiphenomenon of the brain or not? And we're just not there yet. And then from the monastic side, I think part of it is samaya, that's what their guru has asked them to do, and they followed up on that. So we have to be very careful about that.
Sorry.
I want to add just one point about the Tukdam. The purpose, Professor Gyaza asked about the purpose. Why do the meditators stay in Tukdam? I think that one of the reasons or the purpose could be that the whole life, the different practices, especially with Guya Samaja, Hewajwa, and any kind of special practices that they do, they hold the whole life. So they bring that practice at the end of their life, and so they are deeply in the state of very high meditative state. That is the one reason why the Tukdam takes place for longer term. I just thought to share one of this. And for your question about religion and politics, I just wanted to add one thing that could make some difference to this conversation, is that His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama has officially resigned from active politics, and he is purely a spiritual leadership as of now, and that will be the same, supposed to be the same, if there is new reincarnation. I thought that could make some difference.
Basic purpose, or the main purpose of the Bodhisattva remaining in this samsara is to help us, bring all the sentient beings into the Buddhahood. Or by the case of Avalokiteshvara, is actually in the end he can bring us all into the Sukhavati, in the Buddha land of Buddha Amitabha. He's not come here to doing politics. That's for sure. And especially in both in Tibetan and Chinese sources. If we like the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara is the Bodhisattva of compassion. Out of compassion, he want to help all of us. That's why he so willing to reincarnate in this world, and he can be a politician, because according to the faculties and the intelligence of all the sentient beings, if we need a wise ruler, he will reincarnated as a political leader. But he can be also reincarnated as a husband and a home, a wealthy man, and a businessman to help others. He can like reincarnate in various forms. But I think doing politics is not his main purpose, is to saving us. But in Tibetan Buddhism, we have actually advanced approach. Then in Chinese Buddhism, we can like meditate on doing the deity yoga of Avalokiteshvara, or in both ways, in the generation stage or the how to say the completion stage, we can meditate on Avalokiteshvara, then use the technology the Professor Tidwell mentioned. Eventually, like we can transfer our mind directly into the Buddha land, Sukhavati, where we become Buddha. So actually, he is come to this world to help us and bring us into the enlightenment, into the Buddhahood. But we should not trap him too deeply in the samsara.
Thank you. So based on my last interchange with my dear colleague Janet, I expect that this will be the last time I'm asked to moderate such an event. It's been... I want to just close by this last opportunity to moderate such an event by thanking our panelists for such a rich and actually inspiring set of papers, which I, for one, needed today, and I look forward to the rest of the presentations. Please join me in thanking everyone.